All right. I think we are ready to go here. Hello, everyone. Welcome to PNP Live. My name is Bashan. I am part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. Before we do get started, just want to do a couple regular housekeeping items, if you would. First is that at any time during this event, if you would like to ask a question of Ambassador Kaplan, we ask that you would place it directly into the Q&A box. So that way it can just help us to facilitate the question and answer period. Additionally, at any time during this event, you'll be able to go separately to the chat section and you'll be able to find a link which will take you directly to a Politics and Prose website where you can purchase a copy of Night in Tehran. Of course, we highly encourage and thank everyone for your patronage doing that. I today have the honor of introducing to you Ambassador Philip Kaplan. Ambassador Kaplan had a 27-year career as a diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service, including being U.S. Minister, Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge d'Affaires to the U.S. Embassy in Manila, Philippines, during the tumultuous overthrow of Ferdinand Marcos. Now retired from the State Department, Ambassador Kaplan is currently a partner in Berliner, Corcoran, and Rowe LLP's Washington, D.C. law office, where his practice is focused on public and private international law. Today, we are discussing his new book, Night in Tehran. Based on historic events and frighteningly relevant today's headlines, a taut thriller about one American diplomat's year of living dangerously in Tehran in the days leading up to the Iranian Revolution. In the style of Alan Furst, this suspenseful thriller based on real events places an idealistic American diplomat in a turbulent US-hating Tehran in the days leading up to the Iranian Revolution, backed by the CIA, and trailed by a beautiful and engaging French journalist he suspects is a spy. David Weiseman's mission is to ease the Shah of Iran out of power and find the best alternative between the military, religious extremists, and the political ruling class, many of whom are simultaneously trying to kill him. Without any further ado, Ambassador Kaplan.
Good afternoon. I'll be reading briefly from the first chapter of the novel, and then we look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Paris, a foggy morning in the Place de la Concorde. Poking above the rooftops of the left bank of the Seine, a blinking red light was all that could be seen of the Eiffel Tower. David Weiseman shook the drizzle from his overcoat and then dodged through the cars streaming into the great square. He hustled past the Hotel de Cleon and across to Avenue Gabriel. Get on with it, he told himself. He strode past the U.S. Embassy, casting only a quick glance at the tough-looking French flicks twirling police batons, staring down nosy American tourists. A clap of thunder hastened his step. 10 minutes later, he crossed the ornate Pont Alexander III, homage to the Holy Alliance that endured for 100 years until the guns of the First World War shattered a century of post-Napoleonic peace in Europe. Diplomacy rarely, if ever, succeeded like that. Across the Seine, he took in the Quai d'Orsay, said to be the home of the French mandarins who considered themselves masters of the stylized international ballet known as diplomacy. The fine art meant staying on one's toes, sustaining the process, never letting it break down. But it did break down, Weiseman knew, remembering Berlin, the Grunewald, every 20 years or so in Europe, leading to the two world wars of the 20th century. And so he saw things differently, reminding himself diplomacy wasn't just about process or compromise. It was about persuading the other country that it was in their interest to do what you wanted them to do. Trevor, said Gramont, the man Weiseman was on his way to meet, could be trusted. Well, he didn't quite say that. Trevor, Weissman's boss, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, didn't trust anyone. He said Laurent Gramont was important, the door into the French elites. At the Foreign Ministry, a young woman in outsized amber glasses led him to the Secretary General's office. Gramont was with an aide, giving instructions. He held himself tall and straight in a perfectly tailored, double-breasted gray suit with a subtle dark stripe, a silver tie with a pearl tie tack, matching cufflinks on his white shirt. His hair was a richly toned silver gray. He was a French Trevor, knowing and discreet, no doubt ready to be ruthless. Monsieur Weissman, quel plaisir. Gramont's inner office was a gorgeous empire spectacle, separated from the outer world by mauve silk drapes. The gilt inlaid desk was devoid of any papers. A revolving globe stood to the right, Europe on top, France in the middle. Weissman gestured toward it. Still the center of civilization, I see. Gramont allowed the kind of half smile that also reminded Weissman of Trevor. It's our mission, he said, but please have a seat. He lifted the phone, whispered, "Du café." Justin Trevor suggested I see you first, Weissman said. I'll be... Oh, yes, of course. I know your role. Justin called me from Washington. Weissman remembered the words. I need you to find me someone to replace the Shah, to run the country for us. A general, a cutthroat, a cleric, but our man. Our entire position in the Middle East depends on it. Gramont sat perfectly still, a modern-day Renaissance prince, a Machiavelli, waiting to grant a trivial favor. Like Trevor. What exactly is their relationship? Weissman wondered. You and Justin, you go back a long way, he asked. Oh yes, one could say that. We were in Moscow together as ambassadors before he went to Prague. He told me about his promising young protege during the Prague Spring, an idealist who stood his ground, made him reconsider his own positions. Not so easy to do with Justin. So it seems you're un homme sérieux, someone we can work with. Well then, Weissman asked, has there been any progress in the New Year's Eve incident? Ah yes, the ritual executions. Quite grisly, Gramont said. In bed, nude, their throats were slit. The man was an anti-Shah exile, a Bazari, a businessman who came to Paris when things got hot. Weissman took that in without comment. Gramont had been calm in relating the barbaric acts, but it was obvious that the French were concerned Iranian infighting in France might spread. Weissman asked, who did it? What do your services think? Tien, it's a bit of a puzzle. The woman was a relative of Empress Farah, fabulously wealthy. The word was that she liked to play. A puzzle indeed, Weissman said, wanting him to get to the point. Gramont turned his head ever so slightly, his Adam's apple bobbing a bit, a trait Weissman had noticed before among high French dignitaries. Perhaps a political assassination by Savak, Gramont suggested. Weissman shook his head, recalling what Trevor had told him. The Shah's security service in Paris? Well, the French would say that, wouldn't they? The Shah's our man. The French are betting he'll be gone soon, so they can pin it on Savak and wait to displace our influence in Iran. I see, Weissman said. Of course, it's not just a police matter, something political. Oh, yes, Gramont replied. With the Middle East, it's always political. In France, we have bitter memories of the Algerian War, of blasts in our metro stations. That was only 20 years ago. Our Muslim community has been quiet since then, but I have no illusions. New Year's Eve, and then the Sorbonne killing of that young woman, suicide bombings are quite possible. And we monitor the Iranian factions. They could wage a jihad against each other in Paris. Ah. The door opened, and a man in a white starched jacket with gold epaulets came in bearing 2 white cups and saucers and 2 tiny glasses of water on a silver tray. The phone rang, and Gramont spoke softly into it, switching to an indecipherable Breton dialect. Weissman looked around the office. There was a watercolor that looked like a Monet. He got up to examine a gold plaque on a nearby walnut table. The dedication was to Le Comte Laurent Gramont, from former President Charles de Gaulle. So royalty then. And next to it was a facsimile of the ribbons in Gramont's suit lapel, Le Croix de Guerre. Gramont hung up the phone. He was sure, he said, there was much he could offer a colleague of Justin Trevor's as it affected matters in Iran. He would be honored to put his new American friend in touch with the right people. And then, smooth as silk, please call me Laurent. You'll come to dinner at my home on Saturday. We have to do our work quietly, under the radar, as Justin would say. Saint-Germain-des-Prés was a short walk away, through the tangle of narrow streets and alleys that flowed up from the Seine, between 17th century buildings once occupied by French royals, by the noble facade of the École des Beaux-Arts, and on to the medieval church. Weissman paused and thought of Trevor, how the new CIA director had surprised him the day after Jimmy Carter's inauguration by plucking him out of the State Department and assigning him on detail as his personal agent to deal with the looming crisis in Iran, supposedly a reward for his work during the Prague Spring on his first Foreign Service assignment. There were others Trevor could have chosen, Middle East experts, fluent in Farsi, but he had insisted on Weissman, because I trust you. Moments later, he turned onto the Rue de Varenne, pushed on double doors, and entered an enclave. Rue Cité de Varenne, an upper-class oasis insulating its residents from the hurly-burly of the city, the sounds and smells, the stream of pedestrians, the blaring klaxons of speeding taxis. He started down a dark path, past enclosed tennis courts. Overhead, lights suddenly came on, illuminating 4 white townhouses. Number 8 was at the end of the road. He stepped up to the door and pressed the bell. A barely audible chime sounded. A maid in a black dress and white apron opened the door. Bonsoir, Monsieur Weissman. A bronze equestrian statue with a stern Roman gladiator guarded the stairwell. At the top of the stairs, Laurent Gramont, in a 3-piece black tie ensemble, stood on a finely woven Persian carpet. The townhouse was a melange of East and West. The walls were a beige silk decorated with a motif that looked like Louis XV before the Revolution, when the aristocrats still ruled the roost in a well-guarded enclaves. Behind Gramont, guests whispered under the chandelier he had seen from outside. It was a formal affair. Black ties for men, women in long silk dresses. This is David Weissman, Gramont announced, escorting him in. En route to Tehran. Heads nodded ever so slightly. A muscular man with a shock of gray hair approached, followed by an elegant woman, offered his hand and introduced his wife. He was the Minister of Defense. Next, a shipping magnate and a younger woman, not his wife. A professor at ENA, the elite French École Nationale d'Administration, his wife, a couturier. Across the room, Weissman saw a tall man with a white Van Dyke beard and sunken cheekbones, yet deeply tanned for all that, with a tiny white mustache beneath a prominent nose. This is someone you'll want to meet, Grammont said, and led Weissman over there. Alain de Rose, the man said. He looked a bit like James Angleton, the old paranoid CIA counterintelligence chief. Chain smoking, brushing ashes off his tux onto the superb Tabriz carpet. Sûreté was written all over him. Grammont confirmed. Alain monitors the Proche-Orient for our services, the Near East from Egypt to Iran, the Saudis and Gulf Emirates, and of course, Israel. Then you're involved in the investigation, Weissman said casually. He knew the parasocial scene, the little tricks and moral pieties that enabled one to inquire without breaching the code of the French upper crust. Yes, of course. De Rose's office was gruff, almost as if his larynx had been removed. The Iranian girl at the Sorbonne, but it's more than one assassination. We've got a sticky web of Iranians in Paris, fighting it out by proxy over what will happen when the Shah goes. Heels tapped. Et enfin, Grammont said, our hostess has appeared. Finally. Weissman turned to see a 5'10" woman in black silk, dark hair cut short, a rakishly tied belt that highlighted her narrow waist. This was Margot Grammont. She thanked him for the flowers he had sent along that afternoon, then introduced a lovely young woman in an emerald green silk dress with long, glossy black hair. Yasmine de Rose was a student at the Sorbonne and the daughter of Alain de Rose. A tuxedoed waiter came up and whispered into Margot Grammont's ear. Dinner is served, she said. There's one more couple expected, but we may begin. A fork tapped on a glass. Laurent Grammont welcomed his guest with words that flowed like the Seine. The maid entered and announced, Monsieur Schreiber et Madame Dantou. The chunky man wore a tuxedo with a red bow tie and pocket square, red braces and cummerbund. Gray-black hair was combed straight back and brilliantined flat against his skull. The woman was altogether different. In her early 30s, slim, a gold gown highlighting lustrous blonde hair in a chignon with a jeweled clasp. The host and hostess embraced the woman, then shook hands formally with the man. Laurent Grammont said, we're pleased to welcome our dear Françoise once again to our home, and Jacques Schreiber, just in time for dinner. A black tie waiter swept away the coquillage, a formidable array of prawns and scallops and clams and mules, oysters from Normandy. Weissman chatted easily in French with Yasmine de Rose and Françoise Dantou, each one next to him from one side or the other. He asked Françoise what Jacques did, wondering what could be their relationship. Jacques is in the armaments business, Françoise said. In the Middle East, in Iran and Saudi, also in Libya. Weissman asked, and when he travels there? He goes alone, she said. And you? I'm a diplomatic correspondent for Le Figaro, specializing in Iran. I speak Farsi and go there often, and to Iraq. She caught his eye. We're not a couple. Vous comprenez? The wife of the Secretary of the Minister of Defense said, look, I don't have any use for French arms dealers, but why not give the Shah's political opponents a chance? Weissman wondered, why not indeed? And who are these opponents, he asked. Would we want to see them in power? Religious fundamentalists are operating right here in Paris. Isn't that true, Laurent? Well, we've seen those reports, Grammont said. It's very complicated, rather opaque. Not so opaque, Yasmine suddenly said aloud. Iranian exiles at the Sorbonne are organizing into cells, pro and anti-Shah. There are Sabak agents in training, religious fanatics, spreading the word of the Ayatollah. Students are being beaten up. One was even killed. And that Iranian couple murdered here on New Year's Eve. Weissman thought she seemed extremely agitated. It was more than the usual fevered debate at a diplomatic dinner party. Françoise Dantou said, I interviewed Ayatollah Khomeini in Iraq recently. He was expelled by the Shah years ago. He's the Shah's bête noire. She stared directly at Schreiber, who seemed about to burst a blood vessel. One of your customers, Jacques, I believe. Weissman looked down the table at Grammont and the Rose, quietly studying their fingers. After dinner, the men and women separated into two groups. The ladies in the salon, the men in a den where drinks and cigars were distributed. As Jacques went off to use the phone in the next room, Grammont led Weissman into a huddle with the Rose. Grammont told him that Françoise's father had been close to him. The Rose said Jacques Schreiber was a man of the far right, fiercely Catholic, a collaborator who did the bidding of the Gestapo in the war, a schemer who advanced himself on the backs of others. It's a sordid story, Grammont added. He's been here because we find him useful. Useful? Jacques Schreiber re-entered the room. It's time to go, he said abruptly. Weissman looked up, startled by the peremptory tone. What was that all about? Grammont led them back into the salon. Françoise Dantou appeared a moment later, stunning in a shimmering black fur coat. She gave Weissman a subtle but meaningful look, as if anxious to tell him something. Monsieur, Jacques said crisply, then turned on his heel and headed toward the door. Françoise stepped forward, discreetly slipped a note into Weissman's hand, then kissed him on both cheeks. She pulled her cloak tightly about her, and then followed Jacques Schreiber out into the cold Paris night. Yasmine. Weissman had a feeling she would be able to tell him more about the murder at the Sorbonne. He excused himself and went to look for her. He found her sitting alone in a small book-lined den. She appeared to have been crying. She looked up, but didn't say anything. When you spoke in there about the Sorbonne student being killed, Weissman said, it didn't seem like something you'd only heard about. If you can, please tell me. I'd like to know. Perhaps it would help. Yasmine shook her head, was silent for a moment. She was a friend of mine, Yasmine finally said, a gentle girl named Shireen Majid, from a good family. Her father is a banker in Tehran. She was completely apolitical. For an instant, it looked as if Yasmine would resume crying, but she stifled it and continued. It was the headscarf, she said. Shireen wore it every day. It didn't cover the hair in front of her head. That was her tiny statement, her freedom. Excuse me. They warned her to cover up, but she wouldn't wear the chador. She was a modern Iranian woman, like me. She told me she wouldn't abandon her identity. And now, Weissman felt a gathering force in what she was saying. The way a small wave can crest into something terrifying. Shireen was walking on the Bul Mish, Yasmine said softly. I was about 100 meters behind her when I recognized her headscarf. I was about to call out to her when I saw 3 guys wearing skull caps cross the street toward her. They grabbed her by the arms and pushed her against the wall. One of them pulled the scarf down over her hair so that all of it was covered. Then he tied it very tightly around her throat. Shireen started screaming. She pulled the knot open and fixed it again, her way. They started up again, and she screamed at them, saying she was a woman, not their property. Yasmine's voice had risen, so that it seemed she was the one who was crying out against the attackers. Suddenly, she seemed to shrink down into her body, as if retelling the words had intensified Shireen's terror and her own. Weissman saw before his eyes the 2 slain nudes from New Year's Eve. He felt the waves swelling, ready to crash. And then, he asked urgently. Yasmine took a deep breath. A Mercedes was parked there. A man got out. He was huge, a big man in a jalaba. Yasmine was sobbing now. He reached out to steady her, but she had to get it out, to tell everything. The man drew a long sword out of his jalaba, she said. She sobbed hysterically, reliving what she had seen. He raised the sword over his shoulder, and then he swung it at Shireen. She was standing there, and then, but the words wouldn't come. Thank you very much. Well, I have a question. It starts this that says, how much of this is autobiographical and how much did you live yourself? It's a good question. And there's 2 parts to the answer. None of it is autobiographical in the sense that I was assigned to Iran. But obviously, I'm reflecting in the first chapter and throughout the book my experiences over 27 years as a diplomat, serving also in crisis areas. I was in the Philippines as ambassador during the turnover from Ferdinand Marcos to Corazon Aquino. I saw my share of crises. I was in Chile at the very end of Allende. I was in South Africa just before apartheid ended. And I've been in about 80 countries. So I've seen things like this, if not exactly this. And what I've tried to do is capture what it's like for a diplomat operating in a dangerous crisis area. And my concept has been to have the readers perched on the shoulder of David Weissman, trying to figure out what they would do if faced with the difficult choices that unfold in the novel. Thank you for your question from Yukon, Kelly. I chose this particular novel because, in part for the reasons that I've just explained, that we've taken a young person, an idealistic diplomat, who had already some experience. He'd been in the diplomatic service already for 10 years or more. I have another novel in the oven that's set in the Prague Spring, where David Weiseman is on his very first assignment, which is a sort of a different situation. And I think this enables one to see what it's like to be thrust into the middle of this set of circumstances. And maybe I can say one other word. It reminded me a little bit of my experience in the Philippines. In Manila, we had Ferdinand Marcos at the end of his career as the Shah was coming to the end of his life. Marcos had been there for 22 years. He also had Imelda Marcos, who I had to cope with as well. And on the other side, in the Philippines, there was the New People's Army, a communist guerrilla bunch that was killing 100 people a week near my house. Here, it was different in one sense, but very similar in another. On the one hand, you had the Ayatollahs who were threatening to take over and eventually did, and that led to them still being here 40 years later. And on the other side, you had the Shah of Iran and the Savak Security Service. And in the middle were the moderates. And what I learned in Manila and what I've depicted in this novel is that the problem with moderates when confronted with extremists at either side is that the moderates are usually too moderate. I have another question here asking me if this is a standalone novel, and I've already explained that there's another one coming down the trail that's set in the Prague Spring, and I have some other ideas that derive from my diplomatic career. I'm giving some thought to one that's set in Germany during the period of détente and the Cold War and the Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt. And so here's another question. Why did you choose to start in 1979 and then write a prequel set earlier? That's a very good question. And I think the answer to that is that the question was, what would be the most readable and publishable at this particular stage? I'm a debut novelist. And it's quite clear that Iran is really hot right now. And I can assure you, my friends, that it will remain that way during the upcoming Biden administration. There are a lot of choices that the president-elect will make. He's already announced he wants to get back into the nuclear agreement, and there's a lot of complex questions that flow from that. But that's the reason why I decided to do it this way. And then I want to go back to the prequel, which flows, I think, pretty easily. What can someone learn from this book about the current Iranian regime? Well, the current regime of the Ayatollahs, the regime itself, does not have a lot of people, the Revolutionary Guards, the militias, that I would particularly want to invite to dinner in my house. The Iranian people themselves are quite different. I think that inherently the Iranian people are among the most pro-American people in the Middle East. But the regime is something altogether different. They're responsible in a very significant way for terrorism throughout the Middle East. They support terror groups that have been against the United States interests and the interests of our allies. But there is a potential for a much different kind of relationship if we can get past this present situation. Let me explain it this way. Until 1979, when the Shah was deposed, there was a basic security structure that existed that formed the basis for our interest in the Middle East. We had some allies, Israel, Iran, and Turkey, among them, leading among them. Now, if you look at the situation right now, it seems hard to imagine. Iran is now a very serious adversary, even enemy of ours. Turkey under Erdogan presents his own set of problems. Both of those countries and Israel are sharply at odds. And so there is a potential for a very different kind of Middle East if Iran were to turn to a more peaceful path. And I have the distinct impression that that's what Mr. Biden wants to explore, and that he also wants to explore how we can get back into the nuclear agreement in a way that serves our interests and the interests of our friends and allies in the Middle East. Next question is, how much of the backstory of each of the characters did you plan out, or are they perhaps representations or amalgamations of people you dealt with as a diplomat? Well, you know, I can remember sitting in Politics and Prose when we could all actually gather together and asking my now good friend Alan Furst a question like that. I asked him whether or not he sat down and planned out the plot from beginning to end, as some very good and prominent authors do, or he allowed it to evolve as the plot went along. And he told me that it was more the latter than the former, and that's certainly the way I approach it. I had a certain knowledge of the way things unfolded in the Middle East. I wasn't living in Iran, but I did work on Iranian issues in the policy planning staff of the State Department. So I was familiar with it, and it had an impact on me. I was familiar with the fighting and backbiting within the State Department over what our policy ought to be. And so what I did was I made a very cursory outline, and then I got cracking. And I allowed this thing to build. And I'm absolutely convinced that whatever may be the better parts of the novel evolved because I let it grow organically. Now, to that, I have to add a very significant caveat, which any potential writer learns very quickly. The first draft is just that, a first draft. After that first draft comes a lot of revisions, and the real hard work of the novel and the point where it either becomes something that's worth reading or not comes in those revisions. It can be tedious, it can be difficult, but if one works it, it makes a big difference in the way the outcome develops. So I have another question that's marked privately. How do you prepare to be a diplomat? What qualities serve you well? Well, you know, I've also been teaching. I have taught in 5 different universities, including here in the Washington, D.C. area, starting at Brown University. And I had a professor once who said the secret to success is read, read, read. You can't do too much of it. And then I took a trip up to Princeton once when I first came in the Foreign Service, and I had the opportunity to meet with the legendary Ambassador George Kennan, who invented the containment strategy. And I asked him, what is the secret to a Foreign Service career? And this distinguished gentleman had the good grace not to laugh at me. And he said, the secret to a good Foreign Service career is the secret to any Foreign Service career. It's to be in places that matter when they matter. Another thing that's very important is to be able to get into the head of the diplomats that you're dealing with from the different countries. Every country has a different political culture, and one needs to get your head around that, to understand what their values are, what their interests are, and then to try to come up with solutions that are mutually accommodating. In the first instance, that protect the interests of the United States, a point I think I alluded to early in the chapter I read you. But in addition to that, that takes into account the other side as well, if you want the relationships to endure. Henry Kissinger once wrote about Otto von Bismarck, who was called the Iron Chancellor in the late 19th century, who built Germany's power in the late 19th century, but always when he struck eventual peace deals, left enough self-respect and dignity for the power that had been overcome so that the arrangements actually endured until his father, a very impetuous and volatile character named Wilhelm II, took over as emperor. And then we had the First World War. Any other questions? All right. Would you care to comment on whether this time in America is a time when moderation is too moderate? Well, I guess we could do with a good deal more moderation. Right now, the country is sharply at odds. The losing candidate, the incumbent president, still got about 73 million votes. That's a lot. There's a lot of people who cast those votes who, even though President-elect Biden will take office on January 20th, I'm quite confident of that, may believe that they were cheated. The president-elect has made clear that his focus will be to bring the country back together. It will be a daunting but absolutely vital task. Charles de Gaulle in France, when he took over in the midst of the Algerian War, accomplished many things, but the most important, in my view, was to convince the French people that they could put things back together again and again be a great nation. Ronald Reagan is different a human being from Charles de Gaulle almost as one could imagine. Not a Catholic intellectual in general from the Provence area of France, but a sunny Californian and former movie actor and then California governor. Did the same thing for this country. We had a really, really tough period in the Carter period, including the episodes that are depicted in this novel relating to Iran. But yet he was able to convince the people they could come back again. And we did. And let me tell you, that's what we've got to do now. And I'm particularly gratified that that's the commitment of the incoming administration. When you're faced with the kind of crisis that is depicted in this book and some other experiences I've had, it's not my counsel that moderates should somehow become ruthless. It's simply a statement that decent, moderate civil society people who are the heartblood of a nation, when they're faced with extremists on both sides, are unable sometimes to overcome it. What we now need to overcome is a situation where we have extremists on both sides, on the far bases of both sides. They're not the same, they're different, but the bases on both sides believe to a certain extent that only they have the truth. We need to find a way for the two sides to talk with one another and to find common positions or accommodations that will enable our country to move on. Now, I'm told there are still some questions in the Q&A link. Let me see if I can find it. Here we are. What do you think of the future of U.S.-Iran relations? How would you guide the powers that be if you could? Well, first of all, I can't. But we've got some excellent new people coming in, I read today, as Secretary of State and NSC advisor in some of the top positions. And I think that the big question that the president-elect has identified is whether we can get back into the nuclear agreement, which he would like to do as long as the Iranians come back into compliance. That's the statement that he made in a foreign affairs article several months ago. The Iranians are not going to be eager to simply jump back in simply to please a new American president. There are forces, internal forces in Iran that would be against that. At the same time, the Iranian economy now is simply ravaged. I've heard personal stories from Iranians who have told me of what it's like there, who've just been out to Iran. So they're hurting badly. Now, in terms of the United States position, our politics are also not uncomplicated. And there will be people for and against going back into the agreement. I personally, since you asked, do not believe the agreement is perfect, but it exists and is a way of constraining an Iranian nuclear program if it is modified in certain respects. There are provisions of the agreement that limit nuclear forces that they're building up. And those limitations will expire in the not so distant future. They have to be made longer. In addition to that, the Iranians are engaging, as I've said, in mischief making in the area, very substantial support of dangerous terrorist groups. And I don't think it's going to be so easy to get the support of the American people or the Congress for an agreement, or our allies for that matter, for an agreement to get back into the nuclear agreement unless those issues are dealt with. I think we should try to do that. I think we should try hard to do that. And we'll just have to see how that unfolds. The next question is, you are a first-time novelist after a long diplomatic and legal career. What is your advice to older first-time authors? Work hard. Learn how to write in the format of a novel. I can tell you, it is a very different kind of writing than writing legal briefs or memoranda or cables to the Secretary of State or the President. You have to leave a lot ambiguous. You should minimize. You should leave it to the reader to figure out what's going on, giving them enough to bite on, to chew on, and to think it through themselves, which makes it more interesting and more fun. It's a demanding art form, and I'm still working on it. But I do think that it's a fascinating art form, and it enables one to reveal more about the way things really work in whatever particular area you're working on, whether it's the State Department or Faulkner's writing about Mississippi many, many years ago, or many other authors. So that's what I would recommend. Then I have a question. Was it inevitable that the Ayatollah took power in 1979? Could it have gone another way? I think the answer to that, the question again, is not could it have been prevented that the Ayatollah took power? Not could the Ayatollah have been a better regime? And I think the answer to that question is that yes, I think it might have been possible to prevent what happened in 1979, to prevent not only the fall of the Shah, who was very ill, but also to find a successor regime that might have been good for the country, good for the Iranian people, and that would have sustained United States interests in the country. And I urge you to read the book if you're up for it, and hopefully you'll be able to define for yourself which courses were missed and what might have made it better. Now I'm asked, David Weissman's backstory includes a childhood in Hitler's Germany, which informs his action in Tehran. We're again in a world of resurgent autocrats. Will this pass? Well, actually, the backstory is pretty important, as you'll see, and as the book unfolds, and as you'll see further, and if and when we get the Prague story out. This is a young man who almost died before and gotten out in rather dramatic ways that you'll find in the book. And his father made him promise that having had his life saved, he owed a responsibility to pay back and do what he could to make sure that things like that never happen again. And I'm asked, should the new Biden administration renounce the concept of regime change in Iran? There's two answers to that, in my opinion. The first is, I can assure you that the Biden administration's intention at this time is not regime change. It's to try to find a way to work things out so that the relationship is resolved in a more harmonious way that protects our interests. The second is, if things get bad enough in international politics, then nobody knows what the final chapter reads like. So it's very incumbent upon us now to do what we can to make this thing work out. Now I'm looking and it says, last question at 6:55, and then we'll come back on to give Pollux and Prose their farewell comments. So thank you all very much for joining us here tonight. I've enjoyed this very much. Your questions were excellent, and I hope very much that you'll be able to enjoy reading the book. There's one last thing here. My wife and I were teachers in an overseas American school in Southwest Iran from 76 to 79. Our small company became the last American company to leave. I hope it's one of the first to return, but first there's a lot of work to be done to make it safe enough for that to happen. Thank you very much again.
On behalf of Politics and Prose, we'd like to thank you, Ambassador Kaplan, for this wonderful event. We'd like to, of course, thank everyone who's attended this event and highly encourage you all to pick up your own copies of Night in Tehran. And we'd like to wish you all a safe day.